Okay, so this session is going to cover another example of sociological thinking. This time we're going to look at the work of Karl Marx. Karl Marx is a mid 1800s to late 1800s social theorist. Doesn't explicitly identify himself as a sociologist, although what he is doing is very obviously sociology. I think part of the reason he doesn't he doesn't identify as a sociologist is at the time that he was being educated, sociology doesn't really exist as a discipline. He sees himself mainly as a philosopher and an economist, but does a very sort of explicitly materialistic analysis of social organization and social order, specifically um, um, an analysis of the importance of economic systems. So, again, somebody using sociological imagination, um, this time looking at the importance of economic systems in structuring and ordering the way that a society works. Marx brings to bear a couple of really, really important elements of what I consider to be very good sociological analysis. The first is a kind of interdisciplinary approach, right? So the idea that multiple disciplines can speak to our understanding of the nature of the social world is something that I find to be very persuasive. Um, as Berger, you guys have read the piece by Peter Berger, of course. As Berger observes, um, sociologists have a lot in common with other what he calls professional peeping toms, right? People who spend a lot of time looking with intense scrutiny and curiosity at things that the rest of us would really rather prefer not get so much attention, right? We tend to be, at least in the United States, a much more private um, um, society, a private culture. We don't like to let people into our business too much. Um, but a sociologist is not going to let something like that deter them from asking a lot of uncomfortable and critical questions. And Marx is a good example of somebody who does just exactly that. He brings, as I said, he brings a kind of economic and philosophical perspective. The other thing he brings is a historical point of view. History and sociology are probably, like this in terms of disciplines. I know a lot of people think that sociology and psychology are disciplines that are very, very similar to each other, but in the social and behavioral sciences, I think that sociology and psychology are kind of at opposite ends. The unit of analysis is fundamentally different, right? Psychology is interested in individual cognition and individual level phenomenon. Sociology is very much interested in the social. But in addition to that, the underlying assumptions about what's important and what's going to drive our focus and our interest and our concerns very, very different from what motivates and drives psychologists. Sociology has a lot more in common with history, a lot more in common with geography than it does with psychology. So Marx brings all of this to bear on trying to understand how a society is organized, much in the same way that Durkheim does later. Marx comes before Durkheim, even though we talked about Durkheim first. In much the same way that Durkheim will at the very end of the 1800s, Marx is doing that in the middle of the 1800s. He's born in 1818, died in 1883. Spent most of his productive years in England, in part because they kicked him out of Germany. Um, uh, but he was mostly known for his analysis and critique of capitalism. That's probably what he's probably most famous for across the board. In the United States, he has a kind of an association with uh, the Soviet Union. I think a little bit unfairly. Soviet Union came about long after Marx was dead, so it's not as though he played a role in that. But the economic and political philosophies of Marxian sociology certainly informed the development of political philosophies by people like Lenin. So there's a kind of connection there. And because the United States was an ideological opponent of the Soviet Union during the Cold War, um, Not surprisingly, Karl Marx gets a little bit of a black eye by association. Um, I think that uh, I think that as a sociologist, he's probably at this point in the early 21st century, he's probably more influential than Durkheim. Durkheim's theories were really um, um, influential in the first half of the 1900s. By the time we start to get into the mid to late 1900s, some of the contradictions and some of the problems with Durkheimian sociology are starting to get a little hard to avoid. The Marxian and the Weberian approaches, and we'll talk about Max Weber next. But the Marxian and Weberian approaches hold up a little bit more. They're more robust. They're better at generating predictions that are actually supported by data, and that really, at the end of the day, is the measure of a good theory. Does it generate predictions, and are the predictions supported by data? And the answer to both of those questions for Marx's sociology is yes. So I mentioned a bit earlier in the semester historical materialism, right? The idea that society is contingent on being able to produce the resources that it needs to survive. That approach is very much part of Marx's approach to doing sociology. He is what we sometimes call an economic determinist, although I think that's a little bit of an oversimplification of Marx. He doesn't discount the impact of things like culture or other social features. But it is probably fair to say that he sees the economy as the primary driver of social order and social organization. He argues that you can consider a society as consisting of two parts. There is the base, and there is what's called the superstructure. Now, these are engineering terms. The base essentially refers to the foundation. The superstructure refers to everything that rests on top of that. And for Marx, the base in a society is its economic structures. So a society predicated on feudalism as an economic system of production is going to have specific and particular cultural and other structural features that will be different from a society that is built on a foundation of agrarian production. And a system of agrarian production is going to have a different set of social and cultural arrangements than one that's predicated on capitalism. And even within capitalism, right, merchant capitalism is going to look very different than industrial capitalism. And by making this connection between the underlying economic system as the foundation or the base and the rest of society, he points to the way in which arrangements outside of economic production are ultimately organized around and oriented toward legitimizing and reinforcing the underlying economic system. So in a capitalist economic system, education, for example, is going to reflect the demands and the needs of capital, right? So, not surprisingly, in the late 20th and early 21st century, colleges and universities are organized around getting students prepared for the labor force, right, for jobs after graduation. I don't know, right? Education used to be about giving people knowledge and information and skills. The degree to which that knowledge and information and skills reflected the interests of corporations and firms wasn't always present, right? It's been a relatively recent addition. We see that influence, right? The needs of capital, the needs of employers shaping what gets emphasized in and the experiences that you have as students within colleges and universities are largely going to be a reflection of that. So, right, the idea here is that that the underlying needs of the economic system are going to drive institutional organization and institutional activity in other areas of society. Um, he being Marx, also sees society as something that's separate from individuals per se. And I think I kind of alluded to this earlier. But again, I want to sort of restate this, right? That he writes a book in the 1850s called The Grundrisse, which is a follow-up to probably his most influential and important book, which is Das Kapital. In the Grundrisse, he writes that society doesn't consist of individuals, but expresses the sum of interrelations, the relations within which these individuals stand. So he is taking a very explicitly external view of society. Society is not a thing that's made up of the people, but rather what's going on between the people. Obviously, the people have to put those social expectations into action, but it is the interrelations that is society, not the people themselves. His other really large contribution, two really large contributions. One is a focus on what he calls political economy. Political economy is basically just the conditions under which production and consumption are organized in a nation state. So in a capitalist economic system, the political economy is going to look a certain way that will be different than what it looks like in a mixed economy, or in, say, for example, something that's a little closer to the socialist end of the continuum. That dynamic is a function of, again, the underlying economic system. And where Durkheim is going to suggest, at the end of the 1800s, is going to suggest a set of social and institutional arrangements that are designed to produce order and stability, Marx and other people kind of working in that tradition are going to make an argument that the thing that actually drives society is conflict, that conflict is actually inherent in a given society because different groups within societies have different material interests, they have different material realities. So you can think about this in kind of a microcosm when you look at what workers want from their places of employment and what employers want from places of employment, right? Places where production occurs, where consumption is facilitated. So when you go to work, and when I go to work and other people go to work, what we really want is to get as much money as we can, right? That's a rational desire. We want to get a return on our investment, so we want to get as much money out of that relationship as we can. In exchange for that, of course, we're going to offer up our labor power. We measure it in increments of time often, but it isn't really time; it's labor. And the amount of labor that we want to give in exchange for that money is as little as possible, right? So we want to get as much money as we can in exchange for as little labor as possible. That, again, that is maximizing the return on your investment. That's not cheating. It may sound like it, but that's just you or me or somebody else pursuing their rational interests. Your employer wants exactly the opposite, right? They want to get as much labor out of you as possible in exchange for as little money as they can be compelled to part with. And again, they are not cheating. That is what they are supposed to want as people who are trying to increase profit at the expense of controlling labor costs. So you have two groups of people, capital and labor, locked in a relationship, right? Because labor needs to exchange its labor power for wages so that they can go out and become consumers. Capital needs to purchase labor power to do the work to generate the products or services that will be sold to generate profit. So these two groups of people each want something completely different out of the same relationship, right? So they're locked in a relationship, but they want two different things out of that relationship, and that is what we call a conflict relationship. Now, what form that conflict takes is pretty varied, most of the time that struggle is a political struggle. It's not, let's show up to the doors of Buffalo Wild Wings with a pitchfork and torches. It's, how do we as workers come together to advance our interests as workers? Maybe we form a union. Maybe we, as a voting bloc, elect politicians who will push for, better working conditions or a higher minimum wage, or, those kinds of interests. Capital comes together and they form lobbying organizations. They manipulate schedules and how much time workers are actually sort of put on the clock so that they can avoid having to pay overtime. Walgreens just very recently was in the news. A number of stories, hundreds of stories about losing money to shoplifters. But the amount of money last year that Walgreens lost to shoplifting was a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the money that Walgreens stole from its employees in the form of wage theft, which generated almost no stories in the media. Right, so something that was far more costly to society and to individuals in society barely registers as a blip, right? Because corporate media is going to be more dependent on the advertising revenue from companies like Walgreens than it's going to be from subscriptions or other kinds of revenue generated by consumers of media, right? So that's the side of the bread that gets buttered there. So that's kind of, again, a Marxian analysis would look at conflict and say conflict is inevitable. Conflict is not even necessarily bad. It's just groups of people who have competing interests kind of working out those competing interests in the political and social arena. Sometimes the political struggle boils over into actual overt conflict. That has certainly happened in the past, and it's probably likely to happen again in the future. But most of the time when we look at conflict through this kind of Marxian lens, we're not looking at like violent conflict, we're looking at political conflict, groups working out their political and social agendas through institutionalized and formalized means. So there's a lot there, and we're going to explore a lot of this, especially as we get into our analysis of stratification and social inequality, a Marxian and a Weberian frame and lens through which to analyze that is, generally speaking, going to be a pretty useful set of tools. But I wanted you guys to have an understanding of sort of the overarching sort of concerns and focus that Marx brings to bear, that society is comprised of groups with competing interests. It's the tension and conflict that's being addressed that creates social change. He being Karl Marx again, makes a very astute observation that the resolution of a particular conflict or the resolution of a particular set of tensions creates the next set of tensions. It's a process called the dialectic process. He took this notion from philosophy and applies it to the material world in something called a dialectical materialism. So say, for example, workers and management are kind of in conflict with one another because the interests of workers is to get significant amounts of revenue in the form of wages. In order to maximize profits, capital is going to try to reduce labor costs, right? And so one of the ways you reduce that tension is maybe you take your factory and you move it from central Illinois to someplace in China. Well, your labor costs are now a lot less expensive, and that resolves that particular tension. The problem now is that the workers who are left behind are working in jobs that pay less than the jobs that were there when the factory was present, which makes them less effective as consumers. Right? Now, capital is kind of caught on the hooks of a dilemma in that it needs to pay its workers as little as possible in order to maximize its profits. It also needs its workers to have a lot of money to be effective consumers because we're producing goods and services that we want to sell to these people. So resolving one tension or one conflict in capitalism inevitably establishes whatever the next one's going to be. And resolving that next tension, that next problem, will create the third iteration, right? And this is how societies change over time. It's not external forces. It's not sort of random innovation or entrepreneurship. It's the fact that resolving conflicts establishes the parameters of the next conflict, and conflicts need to be resolved, so the next set of conflicts will be resolved in favor of creating a situation in which new conflicts arise. And that's how we get social change. And Durkheim's model of sociology doesn't really provide for that, right? Because if structures exist because they're functional, then, why would they ever change, right? The fact that they're functional suggests there's no need for them to change. And so that's going to be something we talk about a little bit briefly when we look at theoretical paradigms a bit later. All right, so that kind of wraps it up again for this example of sociological thinking, a guy who was looking at the nature of industrial society in the 1800s and trying to figure out how was it that society came to be organized like this? What explains these tensions between capital and labor, and why was that not a relationship that was as fraught and problematic during, say, for example, feudalism, which was the economic system that came right before the emergence of capitalism? And why was feudal society different from agrarian society, which was the system that was in place before feudalism arose, right? So this idea that a society's organization and a society's order is going to emerge from and ultimately reflect its underlying economic systems is, again, a really good example of a guy using their sociological imagination. So there you are. Next time, we'll talk a little bit about Max Weber. But until then, you guys have a great day.